All right, so we'll go ahead and get started with our session in the afternoon, second day. So Anna Clausen from the University of Göttingen is going to give us a talk on life and Henri Bergson. Great, thanks.
Right. Thank you so much, and thank you to the organizers for putting together this wonderful conference. I really enjoyed the talks so far. Okay, Henri Bergson. Henri Bergson has a lot to say on the topic of our conference, much more than I can present here. I was acutely aware of that while I listened to the talks yesterday, finding prefigured in them those constellations Bergson's thoughts revolve around, like the distinction between rationality and a form of cognition that goes beyond it, the association of mind and memory, and the likeness of mind and life. Unfortunately, I cannot present all that, but I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. What I will focus on in my talk is a specific aspect on Bergson's thought, an aspect, though, which I think grasps what is at the core of his notion of the life of the mind, namely the fact that the mind is creative. In a nutshell, that means that for a conscious being, the present does not contain the future. The mind is, quote, a force which can draw more from itself than it contains. The mind is this creative force because it is temporal. It is not only in time, conceived as a succession of now moments, it rather retains a memory of the time it lived through, such that its living presence is the continuously growing accumulation of lived through time. Accordingly, no moment equals another, every present is singular and new. Bergson thinks that we mostly misapprehend our own temporality. Since it is incommensurate to the form of our intellect, we confuse the creative evolution that we are with the distinct phases, events, and decisions we see when we look back. However, this retrospective reconstruction does not equal our experience of the same events and decisions when we actually went through them, because what we see in rear view as distinct phases and events was still in the becoming. The path we look back on didn't yet exist. Importantly, the confusion of our temporal becoming with its retrospective reconstruction is not just an epistemic mistake. It is existentially significant because it leads us to forego what Bergson considers to be the task of human life, namely the, quote, creation of self by self. If we determine ourselves through our intellect or act habitually, we literally reify ourselves and close off the future. In order to spell out Bergson's account of the genuine creativity of the mind and our common failure to live up to it, I proceed in 4 steps. First, I introduced the concept of originary temporality that is at the center of Bergson's notion of the mind. Secondly, I explain why, according to Bergson, we commonly fail to live up to the kind of temporal beings we are. Thirdly, I present Bergson's notion of the free act, which is the form in which we realize our temporal becoming. And I think that Bergson's understanding of the creativity of the mind culminates in his late thesis that the actuality of the new precedes its possibility, which I will present in the 4th step. Okay, first step, duration. Bergson's thinking originates from the observation that time plays no role in the scientific theories of his time. In a letter to William James, he writes, "It was the analysis of the notion of time, such as it appears in mechanics or physics, which revolutionized all of my ideas. I realized, to my great amazement, that scientific time has no duration, that nothing would have to be changed in our scientific ideas of things if the totality of the real was deployed all at once and instantaneously, and that positive science essentially consists in the elimination of duration, end of quote. Bergson contradicts this ineffectiveness of time, which according to him would imply its unreality. In his eyes, it only applies to systems that can be isolated and treated geometrically. In contrast, the organically structured life, whose paradigmatic form is the human mind, is essentially temporal. For it, the past prolongs itself into the present, and it therefore undergoes changes simply through persisting. This temporality, which constitutes the stuff out of which our lives are made, is what Bergson calls duration. Quote, "Duration is the continuous progress of the past, which gnaws into the future and which swells as it advances," end of quote. Unlike the time that features in mathematical equations, duration is indivisible, irreversible, it cannot be accelerated or decelerated, and it is creative, unpredictable, and, as I claim, substantial. Let me explain each of these characteristics in turn. Indivisibility. Duration refers to the ongoing becoming of the present through the preservation of the past. It thus is a succession, which, however, should not be understood as a sequence of states. Our sensations, concepts, feelings, and ideas are not clearly separated from one another. Rather, they permeate and modify each other. Also, they are not stable in themselves. They continually change to the effect that the difference between the transition between states and the change of a state in itself is only gradual. So the denomination, duration, is misleading in that sense, since it is not meant to designate the persistence of a constant state. The notion of duration thus comprises the seemingly contradictory determinations of unity and heterogeneity. Bergson calls it a qualitative multiplicity, as opposed to a quantitative multiplicity that consists of a countable quantity of entities. Irreversibility. While in geometrical physical systems the same causes produce the same effects over and over again, the fact that we endure means that we change and respond differently to the same conditions. The exact same situation cannot occur a second time for us. The circumstances have changed simply because we retain the memory of its first occurrence. Duration is a, quote, stream against which we cannot go, end of quote. Duration cannot be accelerated or decelerated. Bergson thinks that states of consciousness simply change simply because they persist. After a while, the same sensation is no longer the same. Since time itself is the cause of this change, its content being nothing but duration itself, processes cannot be accelerated or slowed down without changing their quality or nature. So, while a given sequence can be unrolled as quickly or slowly as desired, this is not possible in terms of duration. Think of the nature of movements. We can play a videotape of, say, a running horse in slow motion, but where the actual movement itself decelerated, it would become a different movement. Creation. Duration is creative. The fact that the exact same situation cannot occur a second time implies that the other way around, every present is unique and new. Thus, duration is an, quote, unceasing creation, the uninterrupted upsurge of novelty, end of quote. It is noteworthy that Bergson rejects the classical notion of creativity as the ability to recombine given elements. Rather, Bergson thinks of duration as a unity that is new at each given moment, precisely because it is irreducible to existing elements. Unpredictability. Since duration is unceasing creation, the development of a being who endures cannot be foreseen. While we can, for example, calculate planetary orbits thousands of years in advance, we cannot foresee the decision a friend will make. Of course, given our knowledge of her character, we can predict her resolve, but this prediction is based on her past, which it extrapolates into the future. Even though we may often guess correctly, we do not actually foresee the future. Importantly, Bergson does not think that this is due to our limited cognitive abilities. In order to know the results, even a superhuman intelligence would have to live through the length of time it takes her to come up with a decision. And since it is not possible to accelerate or slow down the development without changing its nature, the superhuman intelligence would not be able to know the result before the friend actually makes up her mind. Foreseeing and seeing thus coincide. Substantiality of change. With his conception of duration, Bergson reverses the classical view according to which change is accidental with regard to a substance. In his eyes, change is, quote, the most substantial and durable thing possible, end of quote. Becoming is not a diminution and debasement of the eternal, it is reality itself. Conversely, stable states count as abstractions. While we can derive them from duration, we will never get hold of duration by assembling an infinite number of immobile states. According to Bergson, our idea of time as a homogeneous medium is due to the fact that we project our inner duration into space. We link our inner experience to the entities that we perceive in the world around us. However, the form of space differs significantly from the characteristics of our inner duration, which I just described. According to Bergson, space is the realm of separation, simultaneity, and juxtaposition. By projecting our inner duration onto space, quote, we get the mixed idea of a measurable time, which is space insofar as it is homogeneity, and duration insofar as it is succession. That is to say, at bottom, the contradictory idea of succession and simultaneity, end of quote. The strokes of a clock, for example, occur one after the other. They don't sound at the same time. If we experience them without counting them, a genuine sound shape is formed in the permeation of the later tones to the previous ones. Counting them, on the other hand, requires separating them from each other and lining them up one after the other. The intervals that demarcate is what we call time. However, employing this spurious concept of a spatialized time, a time that is spread out in space, we tend to misunderstand our own existence. Let us take a closer look at this misunderstanding. The human subject has its living reality in its duration. But at the same time, it is embedded in space and its practical interest is directed towards the material objects that are spread around it. It therefore tends to understand its own inner life according to the model of space. Just as it projects its inner duration into space and finds time as a homogeneous medium, it spatializes its duration. This propensity is further reinforced by sociality and the use of language, which, according to Bergson, is modeled to suit the characteristics of space. The transposition of the temporal into the schemata of the material world affects different layers of the mind in different ways. It works quite well for those states of consciousness on the surface of the self that are relatively impersonal, because these states are comparatively unconnected and unmoving anyway. However, it, quote, becomes more and more difficult the further we penetrate into the depths of consciousness, end of quote. At the deepest and most personal level, states permeate one another and are in constant flux. Unlike those that are relatively external to the self, that can be expressed adequately and consistently through words, they are incommensurate to language. The incommensurability of time and space leads to a kind of inner division of the subject. Due to practical interests and social demands, a second self is formed that occludes the first. Accordingly, in our habitual activities and in social contexts, we are usually only aware of those states that allow for a symbolic representation. Our deep self in its continuous flux, on the other hand, is hidden from us. Yet it is here that our singular becoming occurs. While the formation of the second self is useful with regard to our practical interests and our social obligations, it compromises our freedom. At best, we reconstruct through reflection on motives, causes, and reasons what has actually been decided in our duration, but our inner life can become so encrusted by external impressions and impersonal considerations that we do not know what we actually want. We then come to use the same mechanism through which we first explained our decisions in order to determine ourselves. According to Bergson, we are unfree without even being aware of it. I will now say a couple of words on Bergson's conception of the free act. I begin sketching his critique of freedom of choice theories, which commit the same kind of mistake we do in our common misunderstanding of ourselves. Bergson rejects an understanding of freedom as freedom of choice. In his eyes, the freedom of choice theorist equals the determinist in the description of the act in question. Both represent the decision as a path that forks at a certain point. The only difference between the two positions is that one believes that the subject who chooses one path could have chosen differently, while the other denies this. However, according to Bergson, the whole debate is moot because the description of the act on which it is based is inappropriate. In his eyes, the advocate of the free will, as well as his opponent, confuse the decision-making process with the figure that can be drawn up retrospectively. But, quote, this figure does not show me the deed and the doing, but the deed already done, end of quote. The free act and the doing is an act that emerges from duration. Its criterion is not whether the subject could have acted differently, but whether the act expresses the whole of the self. In contrast to the atemporal decision the fragmented second self makes, the free act bridges past and future. It arises from the entire lived-through time, past, and as an expression of the entire lived-through time, it exceeds it, future. Through acting freely, the self creates itself by prolonging its singular becoming into the future. I want to say a bit more on both aspects. I begin with the future dimension, or self-creation. According to Bergson, making a decision is not an act of choice. It doesn't take place at the bifurcation between different paths, where the subject oscillates back and forth before it settles for one of them. It rather is a process through which we produce ourselves. By this, Bergson does not mean that we give shape to the future course of our lives through the decisions we make. It is not the new circumstances we bring ourselves into that will change us. What Bergson has in mind is that we are transformed through the evolution our feelings, thoughts, and ideas undergo in the process of deciding. It is because of this process that the action that finally emerges is creative and new. We can retrospectively reconstruct it as a fork point. But if the self and its options were actually static entities, we could never reach a resolve. Making a decision is only possible because duration is a changeable unity. Quote, "The feeling itself is a being which lives and develops and is therefore constantly changing. Otherwise, how could it gradually lead us to form a resolution?" A couple of words on the dimension of the past in the free act. Bergson claims that the free act occurs sans raison, which is ambiguous in French, meaning both without reason and against reason. However, Bergson does not want to propagate arbitrariness or sensual spontaneity. To the contrary, he considers it characteristic of our most serious involvements. While we can usually give reasons or name motives for our inconsequential decisions and insignificant opinions, it is precisely when it comes to those resolves and beliefs that matter most to us that we find it most difficult to give an account, because the reason why we cling to them is our entire existence. In this sense, the free act emerges from the entire time lived. Quote, "We wish to know the reason why we have made up our mind, and we find that we have decided without any reason, and perhaps even against every reason. But in certain cases, that is the best of reasons. For the action which has been performed does not then express some superficial idea, almost external to ourselves, distinct and easy to account for. It agrees with the whole of our most intimate feelings, thoughts, and aspirations, with that particular conception of life which is equivalent of all our past experience, in a word, with our personal idea of happiness and honor." End of quote. Accordingly, the bifurcation that the free will theorist identifies as the moment of decision is merely the end point of a process whose beginning ultimately goes back to our birth and perhaps even further. Consequently, the self is not indifferent at the fork point. In order to choose differently, the process of decision-making, and that means ultimately the entire life, would have had to be different. Let me just mention in passing that Bergson further develops this thought in his theory of memory. There he entertains the thought that freedom is gradual. So a person would be free to the extent that they are capable to remember, that is, to bring the past to bear on the present decision. I should add that, apart from being unaccustomed to us, the free act involves a focusing or tension of the mind that is difficult to hold up. It is much easier for us to stick to habit or reasons and let time disperse. Bergson thinks that we are usually not aware of the fact that we create our character through our thoughts, feelings, decisions, and actions. The idea that we look at the deed done instead of paying attention to the deed and the doing prefigures an idea he develops in his late writings, namely his critique of possibility. I want to sketch this critique here because it condenses and further accumulates his understanding of the mind as creative. Bergson criticizes the idea that the possibility of the new precedes its realization. In his eyes, to assume the pre-existence of possibilities means to deny creation. Accordingly, Bergson reverses the order of possibility and actuality. He thinks that actuality precedes possibility. The possible is not, quote, a phantom awaiting its hour, who becomes actual by some transfusion of blood or life. Rather, the becoming of the actual implies the emergence of new possibilities. Duration is a, quote, perpetual creation of possibility and not only of reality, end of quote. This reversal implies the seemingly paradoxical claim that the possibility of the new is subsequent to its actualization. The new will have been possible after it actually came into being, future anterior. According to Bergson, possibility is the image of the new that is reflected into the past. Naturally, this projection can only occur after the new emerged into existence. However, since we find it difficult to grasp that something can begin to be possible, we tend to think that what is possible now has always been possible. And since we think that the whole of our reality pre-existed in form of possibility, we subsequently assume that the possibility of what has not emerged yet does already exist too, even though we cannot grasp it. Bergson calls this the retrospective illusion. Quote, as reality is created as something unforeseeable and new, its image is reflected behind it into the indefinite past. Thus it seems that it has from all time been possible, but it is at this precise moment that it begins to have been always possible. And that is why I said that its possibility, which does not precede its reality, will have preceded it once the reality has appeared. The possible is therefore the mirage of the present in the past. And as we know the future will finally constitute a present and the mirage effect is continually being produced, we are convinced that the image of tomorrow is already contained in our actual present, which will be the past of tomorrow, although we did not manage to grasp it. That is precisely the illusion. Assuming that the possibility of the new preceded its actuality, we fail to acknowledge the creativity of actuality. As a duplicate of the present, possibilities are not suited to explain its becoming. Furthermore, they are particularly inappropriate to devise the future, whose futurity consists precisely in the fact that it contains more than the present. Closely related to the idea that the possibility of the new precedes its actuality is the assumption that its possibility is less than its reality. According to this view, quote, the realization adds something to the simple possibility, end of quote. In contrast, Bergson argues that the possibility of the thing is more, that is, more complex than its reality. It is more because it implies the act of projection in addition to the reality itself. Quote, the possible implies the corresponding reality with, moreover, something added, since the possible is the combined effect of reality once it has appeared and of a condition which throws it back in time, end of quote. By claiming that the new was not possible before it became actual, Bergson does not mean that it was impossible. Bergson readily admits that there was no, quote, insurmountable obstacle, end of quote, to the newly emerging. But he claims that this purely negative non-impossibility is of a different order than the determinate possibility that we attribute to the thing. We must distinguish two meanings of possibility. What comes into being is possible in the negative sense, that is, nothing contradicts its realization. However, this non-impossibility that does not imply the positive possibility that indicates the thing. While its impossibility would prevent the new from becoming actual, the removal of this impossibility does not determine what it is. quote, "If you close the gate, you know no one will cross the road. It does not follow that you can predict who will cross when you open it," end of quote. According to Bergson's diagnosis, we pass surreptitiously from the negative to the positive sense of possibility, thereby sustaining the retrospective illusion. Many of the aspects of Bergson's critique of possibility are, retrospectively, prefigured in his earlier writings. What is new is the focus on forms, that is, on that what is materially brought about in the process of creating oneself. Bergson's interest shifts to the manifestation of this becoming in reality. I do not have the time to spell this out here, but I think that it is not accidental that he develops these thoughts at the same time as he writes his late book on ethics. The logic of possibility and actuality is especially suited to describe the collective life of the mind as a kind of dialectic between individual becoming and emergent forms that become ossified as soon as they become a habitual part of social life. As with possibility, we can talk about progress only retrospectively, because we know the direction it advances into only after the fact. Let me conclude. Bergson turns the classical understanding of time as the moving image of eternity upside down. Time as duration is not falling away from the eternal, it is rather the other way around. Duration is the dynamic reality from which stable forms are derived as mere abstractions. This reversal is not just of theoretical, but primarily of practical and existential significance. We misunderstand ourselves and jeopardize our freedom by being geared to what is permanent instead of paying attention to our inner becoming. Bergson's late critique of the notion of possibility grasps what is at the center of his thought throughout his whole life, namely the creativity of time and the entailed openness of the future. By assuming that the possibility of the new precedes reality, we diffuse the creative evolution we participate in into a realm of eternal ideas in which everything new that will come into being is already preconceived. Instead of acknowledging the admittedly dizzying fact that we cannot foresee the future because it exceeds the present, we thus annihilate the future, whose futurity consists precisely in the fact that the possibility of what will become doesn't yet exist. Bergson thus highlights the openness of the future. The flip side of his emphasis is that on his account, the dimension of the future remains a blank slate. Since the present does not contain the future, he doesn't have much to say about the future at all. What it will have been can only ever be determined in retrospect. Together with this blankness of the future dimension, Bergson neglects the problem of finitude. Even though he sometimes mentions death, his thinking is not suited to accommodate the importance our awareness of death has for our lives. These shortcomings of Bergson's account of the future are reflected in the narrowness of his concept of possibility. For Bergson, possibilities belong to the realm of the past. They exist only after the fact. Would they precede actuality, true becoming would be impossible. This, however, is not the only possible conception of possibility. By focusing on it exclusively, Bergson underestimates the importance of our life projects and projective ideas. Entertaining them, we do not foreclose, but rather open up our futures. In contrast, rejecting possibilities and choice means turning freedom into a blind spontaneity that only ever experiences the outcomes of its actions after the fact. Thank you.